A reading from 1 Kings. At Horeb, the mount of God, Elijah came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." God said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu son of Nimshi as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." The word of the Lord. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my spirit be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. The prophet Elijah fears for his life. He has done his faithful job as a prophet. He has preached the word that God has commanded. He has done everything that could have been expected from him. But instead of a reward, instead of accolades or a pat on the back about a job well done, he is running in fear and hiding in a cave. The people have not been as eager to hear what Elijah has to say. They have not listened to him, but rather have done the opposite. They have abandoned God's commandments. They have stopped caring about the most vulnerable in society. They have hoarded up wealth for themselves. They have begun to worship idols and turn to other gods besides the one true God. And they are so tired of hearing Elijah tell them to turn back to God that they are trying to kill him. He cannot trust anyone to help him. He is on his own, and after he cannot run anymore, he finds a cave to spend the night in to hide there. It is the only safe place he has. And while he is hiding in the cave, God speaks to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" God asks. To Elijah, this sounds like a pretty stupid question. What do you mean, what am I doing here? I've done all this work for your sake, and now everyone wants me dead, and now I am hiding in a cave. What do you think I'm doing here? Elijah, perhaps in a haughty tone, probably frustrated, maybe a little angry, gives an account to God of everything that he has done, how faithful he has been, how hard he has worked. "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts." And he gives an account of how wrong the rest of the world is. The Israelites have forsaken your covenant and thrown down your altars. Elijah points out to God that because he is faithful and the rest of the world is not, it has left him in an unsafe position. He is in trouble. I am the only one left who cares about you, God, and the people are seeking my life to take it away. We don't know what Elijah expects God to do after this speech, but if we are anything like Elijah, we can guess. We can guess that Elijah wants God to come very decisively into the world, destroy the people who are doing bad, fix all the things that have gone wrong, and maybe most important of all, put Elijah in a position of power in this new and improved world as a reward for being so faithful during this difficult time. Perhaps Elijah is looking for a pat on the back from God, an assurance that God understands his struggles, a promise that God will save him and get him out of this mess. It is not hard for us to imagine that that is what Elijah wants, because it is often exactly what we want. Of course, our situation is not nearly as dramatic as Elijah's. An entire nation is not seeking our lives, and to pretend otherwise is an insult to the people in the many countries of the world where worshiping God does indeed put them in a situation exactly like Elijah's. But we see the things happening in the world around us that seem so contrary to the gospel. Unjust wars that displace thousands of people, leaving them with nowhere to go and no access to clean water or food. Systemic racism that causes people all over our nation to live in fear. A pandemic that has turned our whole world upside down. People who choose selfishness over compassion, and systems and institutions and leaders taking advantage of a crisis to turn a profit or gain rewards for themselves. We see that all around us in Massillon, people do not have enough to eat or safe places to live or jobs that can pay enough to survive. We see that across America, churches are getting smaller, numbers are dwindling even in the ELCA. We remember how our Sunday schools used to be bigger, and we see how churches just like us are closing down at a terrifying rate. We see how the pandemic has made it even more difficult for people of faith to gather together and do what we are called to do. We see even within churches which are supposed to preach the gospel and share God's love, that leaders are instead abusing their authority to cause harm. And the church as institution is full of the same kinds of systemic racism and sexism and classism that the rest of the world is struggling with. In the midst of all these problems, we sense that God needs to act in a big way. We become overwhelmed with fear, and our first instinct is to do what Elijah did. We hide, not in a cave, but in our sanctuaries and in our homes. We hide and we wait for God to come down and take care of everything, and of course to reward us for how faithful we have been in the midst of such seemingly unfaithful and difficult times. When God, just like God did with Elijah, looks down at us in hiding and says, "What are you doing here, people of God?" our answer might sound similar to Elijah's. What do you mean, what are we doing here? Do you not see the illness sweeping across society? Do you not see the people suffering and in need? Do you not see the corrupt leaders of the world who harm the most vulnerable? Do you not see those who care more about themselves than others? Do you not see the churches who are struggling to get by? We are here because we are at the end of our ropes and we have nowhere else to go. But God's answer to Elijah is not at all what he expected. God tells Elijah that the Lord is about to pass by the cave. And 1 Kings says, "Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence." When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. At first, during the wind, Elijah might have seen these powerful acts of nature at work and thought, now this is more like it. But then I think Elijah knew. He realized that God was not in any of those loud, powerful, terrifying entities. God came to Elijah in the silence. And in the middle of that sheer, deafening silence, Elijah experienced the presence of God. In the midst of this silence, God asks Elijah the same question as before. What are you doing here, Elijah? I imagine God's tone is different now. And Elijah provides the exact same answer, but I bet that Elijah's tone is different too. Gone is the haughtiness, the air of superiority, the urgent plea for help. Perhaps before he shouted, but now he might barely whisper. I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away. Elijah's reason for being in the cave has not changed. His situation is exactly the same as it was before. But after experiencing God's presence in the midst of this surprising, rare moment of perfect silence, Elijah likely already knows what God is going to say about it. And the first word that God gives him should not be a surprise. Go. Go back into the midst of this violent, chaotic world and do your job, Elijah. Before, Elijah felt that he had no other options. He was afraid and very much alone. When God asked him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" he listed all of the horrible things that were happening in the world around him, seeing the world as the aggressors and he, Elijah, as the victim, helpless and afraid. But when God spoke into the deafening silence and asked him the second time, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah saw the world differently. Elijah saw in his second response to God a world that, along with himself, was desperately broken. A world that desperately needed to hear God in a moment of silence so loud that it drowns out everything else. Elijah realized that the very thing he was hiding from was the very thing that God was calling him to run toward. It was the very place where God was already quietly at work. Because God was already at work in the midst of all that chaos. And God was certainly powerful enough to do God's job with or without Elijah. But God was calling Elijah to join in the work for God's kingdom, and God used Elijah's own words to do it. And when we begin to feel overwhelmed by the task that is set before us, when we begin to feel afraid that the problems in the world and in the church are too much for us to ever solve, when we begin to feel that everything around us is big and loud and the only thing that can change it is if God comes back in a big way, we gather together for worship or we set time aside for quiet prayer and devotion in our homes. And we too are surprised by how God chooses to show up instead. God shows up not as a whirlwind or an earthquake, but instead as a baby in a manger. God shows up as a carpenter from Nazareth. God shows up as a man hanging from a cross on a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. God shows up in a letter penned by an imprisoned man named Paul. And God shows up in the unnamed woman who read that letter aloud to an assembly of Christians one Sunday in Rome. God shows up as nurses who quietly risk their lives to care for us every day. God shows up in the midst of the dying. God shows up to those of us isolated at home. God shows up in our midst as we are spaced 6 feet apart. God shows up in ordinary, everyday items, in bread, in wine, and in water. And then, gently, God asks us again, What are you doing here, people of God? And again, we say, we are here because the people of the world are hungry and have no place to live. We are here because there are not enough resources or people to care for everyone who is sick. We are here because those who perpetuate racism are drowning out those who promote your love for all people. We are here because churches are no longer the size and strength they once were. And God says, go. Go and do something about it, people of God. I am with you, I have called you by name, and I am already at work in the midst of these same chaotic places, so go. Go and join in with what I am doing. God never promised Elijah that it would be easy or that now the problems will magically be solved. In fact, God tells Elijah that violence and a significant loss of life among the people is still to come. But God promises Elijah that God's presence is in the midst of the world, just as God's presence was in that cave. God promises Elijah that God is at work in the world and will continue to be at work in the world even long after Elijah has completed his share of the work. And God makes those same promises to us. This morning we experience God's presence with us in the stillness, in the silence, and in the simple bread and wine. Today, we experience God's presence with us in quiet moments of devotion, in the love of our families and friends, and in the love and kindness shown to us by strangers. And then, just as God commanded Elijah, assured of God's presence in the midst of every situation, we go to all the places where God might be calling us. Amen.